Okay, are we living in a simulation? Well, Nikk Effingham's paper, Simulations All the Way Up, says that the fine-tuning argument should push atheists towards an answer of yes. Now, Effingham in the paper concedes the fine-tuning argument is very strong and that a reasonable atheist should appeal to the simulation theory in order to avoid it. The paper's title, Simulations All the Way Up, gives away the kind of core argument. Effingham's move is to say that we're in a simulation, but so are the people who created our simulation. And then their simulators are also a simulation, and so on forever. Just nested simulations all the way up. It kind of reminds me of the movie Men in Black. I don't know if you've seen that one, but basically the spoiler alert, but it's like a 20-plus-year-old movie. In the movie, there's this galaxy that exists inside of essentially the size of a marble. And the protagonist and antagonist are fighting over this marble that is a galaxy. So the idea of like a tiny galaxy within a much broader galaxy. Now, Effingham's paper isn't about like space-wise being a smaller galaxy, but rather being a simulation, I guess, on a computer somewhere. And so that I thought that was pretty interesting. It's an interesting idea. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Effingham's paper. We're going to look at the strength of his argument. We're going to look at some liabilities in the simulation framing and how Effingham's arguments can be saved with just a slight modification. So we'll steel man it just a bit. And then we're going to look at the core pillar that Effingham's paper rests on, even according to Effingham himself, and why it kind of crumbles. So I'll do my best to provide the strongest version of Effingham's arguments, and you can also find a link to Effingham's paper in the description below. So Effingham's paper. Well, first he gives a pretty good summary of the fine-tuning argument, and the setup is very good. He shows that an atheist, even if they have a very strong prior against God, he imagines 10 to the negative 35, right? So that's like 35 zeros and then a 1, or 0.00035 zeros and then a 1. So very, very, very improbable. 1 in trillions upon trillions. Very, very small, unimaginably small. And he says that even in that case, fine-tuning should drive your rational credence from there to almost certain, almost one, that God exists, if the simulation escape fails. So I think that's great. He grants the argument a lot of force. I really like his presentation there. It's concise, and he gives the math on why that should work out that way. I like it quite a bit. And it's important to note that Effingham concedes that design is the best explanation for fine-tuning. Now, the typical fine-tuning argument, it considers three possibilities: necessity, chance, or design. Effingham actually concedes the design point, that it is designed. He's just positing, well, it's designed by simulators rather than God. That's kind of where he goes. And so basically the idea is that if you get a really low probability for God, then even if you think a simulation is improbable, which he admits, like, yeah, it's odd, it's an odd view, but if you think the prior for God is incredibly low and the simulation is not quite as low, then you would prefer the simulation over God. And so that's sort of the move that he's making. It isn't the simulation theory is probably true. It's more, well, if you're looking at these relative priors, maybe it's low, but it's not as low as God, is kind of his attitude. And I got to be honest, as a Christian, I hear that line of reasoning and I think, okay, so he's saying if you're motivated enough to reject God, then you'll reject God in the face of any amount of evidence. Because it seems like for any evidence you might encounter, there'll be some probability that the evidence is just as it is, and yet the conclusion is false. So if you just set the prior probability of the conclusion below that threshold, well, you'll believe anything. And so that's me. That's the way that reads to me. Maybe it reads differently to you. So you might be thinking, okay, but if we're in a simulation, then the people simulating us are in a finely tuned world, so we still have fine-tuning. And Effingham agrees with that. He calls it the real reality response to the simulation theory. The real world running a sim at its own finely tuned constants, so we just move fine-tuning one level up, and the argument has its same strength. And he concedes that that kills every finite chain of simulations, so his move is to go infinite, all the way up. There's no reality anywhere, nothing to rerun the fine-tuning argument. Each reality, so to speak, or each world is fully simulated, and it's in the simulation of another simulation, and you get this infinite chain. And so the infinite chain is the whole ball game, and Effingham concedes that. If infinite chains are not workable, then neither will his paper be workable because of the real reality response. So let's turn to analysis here. First, the literal simulation version is fun, but it has a lot of drawbacks. And Effingham actually provides a stronger alternative in the paper. And we're going to look at the alternative for the points because the simulation theory has some problems. So first, simulated minds, are they even conscious? And Effingham asked this question himself. Is it possible that a simulated consciousness is itself conscious? Could you make a video game so complex that the NPCs are self-aware? Probably not. I think probably not. He doesn't say probably not, but he acknowledges, yeah, that could be a challenge. And also, the simulation theory asks you to believe that all of your sensory experiences are not true. They're non-veridical. So it reminds me of the Matrix movie where Neo and Morpheus are fighting in some practice arena. And Morpheus asks him, do you think that's air you're breathing? Right? The idea is his experience of being out of breath is fake because they're in a simulation. And so the simulation theory would ask you to treat all of your senses as though they're false. So what's more obvious to you, that the things you're looking at are there, or that God doesn't exist? Hopefully, it'll be pretty obvious that your experiences are real. So that's kind of another liability of the simulation theory. And Effingham's paper relies on an infinite chain of simulations. So what that would mean is that there's no real computer anywhere that's actually running a simulation. So you have an infinite number of simulations, but no computer that's ever no real computer that's ever running a simulation. Every simulation is running on a simulated computer, and so that seems problematic. That you could have all these simulations and yet no computer that's ever running them, which seems metaphysically absurd. So the simulation theory is kind of funny, and it may be silly. Maybe that's why Effingham named the paper after that, is because it kind of catches eyeballs. I don't know, but Effingham's arguments don't actually rely on it being a simulation, an actual simulation theory. He also suggests an engineered cosmos as an alternative, and honestly, that just has fewer liabilities than the simulation version. The engineered cosmos is that there's some super race of aliens that designed and kicked off our universe, and so you still get design due to humanoid-like, maybe not humanoid, but sentient creatures, I guess. I don't know what the word is. Engineers. You still get it developed by engineers, but you don't have to deny that your experiences are veridical. You don't have to imagine it running on a computer. You don't have to do any of that sort of thing. And so I think the engineered cosmos is actually the better version because it's got less of those sort of wildly counterintuitive, You can still believe that it's actually air you're breathing and believe that the cosmos was engineered by some sort of super race. So for our purposes, we're gonna ignore the simulation specific objections because I think the engineered cosmos version avoids them. And so, I don't want to attack the paper where it's weaker. We want to attack it where it's stronger. And so we're going to steel man it and just pretend that he's talking about an engineered cosmos instead of a simulation. Again, simulations are fun to talk about. So he does spend a lot of the paper talking about simulations, but because he offers the engineered universe option, has fewer liabilities, that's what we're going to do. So we still have a problem, though, with finite engineered chains. because it's the same vulnerability as the real reality response, right? You still have, well, those engineers were in a finely tuned universe. So 1 level or 10, there's a real physical world at the end that's not engineered by a super race, but is still finely tuned for life. And Effingham grants this, so he wouldn't be surprised by me saying that any finite chain is not going to actually defeat fine tuning. So the fundamental question is, can an infinite chain of worlds, each birthing the next with no beginning, actually hold up? Is that a reasonable thing to believe? So here's the core of Effingham's paper. The problem is Effingham's infinite chain runs entirely on an assumption he just helps himself to instead of earning. So what's his case? Well, to even run fine-tuning, the atheist must already be past cosmological arguments, because why would we be talking about fine-tuning if we hadn't already discarded those arguments? So his reasoning is this. The atheist has some sort of compelling response that he takes to be successful to cosmological arguments. Popular responses to those arguments are appealing to infinite chains. So the atheist must assume he has a compelling response to justify infinite chains. And so thus he's rational in believing that infinite chains are fine for fine-tuning. So that's sort of the reasoning. Well, when you ran if we were running this other argument, the Kalam, I would probably argue for infinite chains. And I'm going to take it to be that I was successful, because here we are talking about fine-tuning. And so then I'm just going to import that and take the infinite chains and put it into our fine-tuning discussion. That's actually the move. So there's a few problems with that move. So first of all, setting aside an argument for the sake of discussion doesn't mean you get to automatically assume you defeated that argument, right? Fine-tuning is a standalone argument, so you can sort of bracket out or set aside Kalam, but it doesn't presuppose that you defeated the Kalam. And so you must already be past it. It just doesn't follow from, we're going to set that aside for the sake of our discussion on fine-tuning. Secondly, setting an argument aside doesn't mean you get to assume that the objections were successful. So setting aside the argument means you get to withhold it. Decline to have it weighed against you. Imagine if the theist were to say, well, we're talking about fine-tuning, so I must have already won the Kalam. I'll just assume God's existence then, right? You wouldn't allow that. And so the atheist can't do it with infinite chains. And number 3, why does he get to pick which rebuttal was successful? He's just assuming, well, if I win that Kalam argument, or the Leibnizian argument, or the Thomistic argument, he gives a few of the different cosmological ones, but we'll just use the Kalam for easy reference. Well, if I win the Kalam, I'd probably win it with infinite chains. Well, why is that? People object to the Kalam for all sorts of reasons. Why does he get to pick that infinite chains was the successful rebuttal? And so, and then lastly, what's to stop the theist from rerunning arguments against infinite chains? If he can import the rebuttal to infinite chains, well, why can't I import arguments against infinite chains? Now, he doesn't actually deal with any of those in the paper. He's just assuming a response. He's got to provide one. He can't just assume, well, I must have beat those. He's got to actually deal with the arguments against an infinite chain if he wants to use it for fine-tuning. Now, Effingham concedes, I know that sounds crazy, like, oh, I must have misunderstood him. But in the conclusion, he actually says, quote, only by building in the assumption that one has successful rebuttals to the cosmological argument can this paper's argument work. Literally, you have to build in the, I assume I won, right? That's a problem. And so even granting everything above, we got one more problem. And it's one that Effingham raises himself, but then he just kind of walks past it. He writes that if God exists, it's likely that there are more organic sentience than had there not been a God. So the reasoning is this. If there's more organic sentience, then there's more potential simulators, or cosmos engineers, if you will, So the probability of God plus sim winds up being higher than not God plus sim, right? Because there's more people to make the sims. And so if God exists, then sim ends up being more likely. Now, this matters because it's relevant to the core of his argument. He wants to raise the simulation as a rebuttal to an argument for God's existence. It doesn't do any good to raise a rebuttal where God's existence ends up being more likely. What's his response to this? He says, well, it's out of scope of the paper. Oh, handy that, right? I mean, not only is defending the core of his argument apparently outside of the scope of the paper, but so is dealing with a pretty key objection to his probabilistic calculus here. I was really surprised by that. I mean, full credit to Effingham for raising the issue. He could have just left it out of the paper entirely, but now that he's raised it, it does seem like the kind of thing he can't just walk past. I mean, if this objection works, then appealing to the simulation theory raises God's existence rather than lowering it. I mean, imagine if I were to say, oh, okay, you want to appeal to simulations? Well, then let's just ditch God and we'll take simulations as an argument for God's existence, right? You couldn't very well say, well, I'm going to appeal to simulations while we're talking about fine-tuning. But then if you want to transfer to talk about simulations, they'll say, well, there's no simulations, right? You can't do that. So it doesn't really work. So let's look at what Effingham conceded. Let's sum this up. Number one, fine-tuning should take the reasonable atheist to a near certainty that God exists if the simulation or engineered cosmos theories don't resolve it. Two, he concedes that the real reality response kills any finite chain of simulations or cosmos or whatever. If it's not infinite, then the real reality response kills this rebuttal. It just doesn't work. And he concedes the whole thing works only by assuming successful rebuttals that he never supplies. So it all rests on one unpaid bill, an unexhibited maximum strength assumption that infinite chains are possible. And he's pulled that out of an argument that he claims to have merely set aside. So what are we left with? What's the benefit of the paper? Well, Effingham gives a pretty clear demonstration at the beginning of the fine-tuning and the strength of it, and how even a strongly biased atheist should think theism is almost certain when faced with fine-tuning. We see how strong the real reality response is to both simulation and engineered cosmos theories. And I actually think Effingham's infinite simulations idea is a great Hilbert's Hotel style illustration on the absurdity of infinite chains. I mean, if you think about it, having an infinite chain of dependency is just like, it doesn't hang on it being computers. You would have simulations all the way up, but no actual real computer ever running a simulation. And why is that impossible? I think it's because you see that dependency is never actually supplied. It's just forever pushed back, but that bill's never actually paid. And so I think Effingham actually unintentionally supplies a pretty strong thought experiment that shows why infinite dependency chains are impossible. So I think that's a pretty good development from the paper. Now, to be fair, this isn't atheism is refuted, right? It's that this one escape route doesn't work. Effingham alludes to other moves to the fine-tuning argument an atheist might take. This is not a complete, it's not a book, it's a paper, right? So he's dealing with one idea. So this isn't atheism refuted, but it was kind of a fun argument, a fun paper to read. I hope you had fun with the video, and thank you for listening.